Good morning, everyone. I hope you're having a great day. It's actually a little overcast in the Pacific Northwest, but we've had great weather. Usually it rains constantly in October. But I wanted to just take you through a little bit of a presentation today, and this is just going to be for talking points purposes. I don't like to drone on for hours on end. I hope you find this interesting, engaging, and helpful. As we said, the topic is getting started with a Cisco certified career, a journey which I have made myself. So I'll be sharing a little bit about that story along the way, and hopefully you'll find it helpful. Of course, first off, I want to do a little bit about the way of introductions. First, just a little about me. This is me and my wife, Brenda. We've been married for 6 years. We have 6 children. Now, I have to explain that a little bit because I always get strange looks when I first mention that. I call it the merger, acquisition, and expansion plan. She has 3 biological children who are the oldest. I have 2 biological children, which are the next batch, and then we have a nephew that we basically adopted. So it keeps us quite busy. We are also published authors, nonfiction, and are regularly involved with a number of different things. Now, a little bit about my professional background. I am a CCIE. I have gone through all the other certifications as preparation for that, so I have an unusual experience level with all of that. I also have an MBA because after I got my CCIE, I decided it wasn't enough, so I wanted to do more. And as far as industry experience, I've actually been in the industry for a number of years. I did a lot in pre-sales engineering and design. I've done some deployment and a lot of instruction. I'm also president of the Seattle Cisco Users Group, and I'm also moderator of the LinkedIn group Cisco, which is all caps. Now, in addition to introducing myself, I just want to do just a brief introduction about Cisco, which you all may already realize. It was actually founded by Len Bosak and Sandy Lerner a number of years ago. This is their current logo. And a little bit about the company. According to their annual report, which their fiscal year wraps up in August, they actually said that for 2011 they had about 71,825 employees. They are obviously a multinational global company. They have a number of different theaters that they participate in, and there were about $46 billion in sales, just to give you an idea of the enormity that is Cisco. Another thing they state very clearly is their vision, which is to become our customers' most strategic business partner by delivering intelligent networks and technology and business architectures built on integrated products, service, and software platforms. So that just sort of helps to frame things a little bit in terms of where I'm coming from and obviously where Cisco is coming from. And one of the things I want to talk about, just simply because this has to do with how to get started with a Cisco certified career, is actually understanding what that means. What you actually have here is a pyramid, which you see very commonly in a lot of the Cisco certification study sites, and there's different levels. First, there's what's called the entry level, which is most commonly associated with the CCENT, or CCENT as it's sometimes called. That stands for Cisco Certified Entry Network Technician, which is the first step. Your ICND-1 exam, for instance, maps to that. Next, you have the associate level, and to be honest, when I started in the industry, the CCNA was the entry point, and then of course they added the CCENT later. But the CCNA, the Cisco Certified Network Associate, and there's a great deal of technology foundation that's built at both of these layers. It really helps to be able to frame not just Cisco technology, but TCP/IP, routing, switching, and so forth. So there's a lot of information available. In fact, I just completed the ICND-1 and ICND-2 courses not too long ago with the help of the Train Signal staff. Next, there's what's called the professional level. Usually the CCENT and CCNA are just associated with a single or pair of exams. The professional level is usually multiple exams. And for the routing and switching and the others, this is the CCNP, and we'll distinguish among the tracks here in just a moment. Then there's what's called the expert level, and this used to be the pinnacle of the pyramid. with the CCIE, the Cisco Certified Internetwork Expert. Something that Cisco also put forward a number of years ago, about two, was what was called the CCA, the Cisco Certified Architect. Now this just requires a little bit of a clarification because the CCA is a design certification. And so the equivalent in the design track for the expert is not the CCIE, but the CCDE, the Cisco Certified Design Expert. At one time there was a CCIE design and they implemented the CCDE a number of years ago, about 3 or so. And then once the CCDE was released, then they actually released the Cisco Certified Architect, which is extremely expensive, requires a series of board interviews, and is quite complex. And last I checked, it was quite expensive, required quite a process to get through because you first have to have your CCDE, then you have to have a series of board interviews, and it's actually in the line of 5 figures to actually obtain. So in any case, this is sort of the panorama of Cisco certification, pretty much from beginning to end. There are some other specializations that you can get, and we want to talk a little bit about that now. Cisco describes this as tracks. In other words, there are a number of tracks available dealing with specific technologies. So first there's routing and switching, which is really the foundational certifications. For instance, the CCNA is actually required for the other tracks. For instance, there's the CCNP in routing and switching, which is just called CCNP, and then there are others. But the CCNA is the entry point to all the other specializations. Next, you have design. Now, the acronyms are slightly different. For instance, the CCNA is not the CCNA in the design certification, it's the CCDA, Cisco Certified Design Associate. And then the acronym for the professional level is CCDP, and then of course there's the CCDE and so forth. But design is another track. Then you have security, and obviously all the certifications then become specifically geared towards security. After you do your CCNA, for example, you can get a CCNA security specialization and then go on to CCNP security and so forth. Next you have wireless. Again, this is dealing with basic infrastructure. We get into a lot of the details of how RF works. And then you have voice, which is voice over IP and the Cisco Communications Manager product and services. There's also a newly introduced data center certification having to do with the Cisco Unified Compute System and various fiber channel technologies and things of that nature, but much more concentrated specifically on the data center. It's one of the newer tracks. You have storage, which deals with large storage arrays such as by EMC and NetApp and how it interfaces with the Cisco network. Then you have the service provider, and this is typically if you're working for companies like AT&T or Verizon or Comcast that actually do large-scale IP networks to be able to provide connectivity to customers. And then there's service provider operations, which is just slightly different in terms of content. So this is just sort of a panorama of all what goes on with Cisco certifications. Now I want to just take a moment right here and explain to you a little bit about what my journey has been when it comes to Cisco certification before we do the getting started slide here. I actually entered the industry in 1998 with absolutely no experience whatsoever. In fact, my previous career was as an ordained minister. And while we can make sort of all sorts of interesting jokes about connectivity in that regard, when it actually comes to technology, there's not usually a whole lot in common with that. My first employed job in the industry was at an internet service provider as a sales representative, and the only thing I basically knew was how to access the internet by dial-up. Gives you an idea how long ago that was. I actually began studying for the CCNA exam. That was the entry point at the time. Went to work for AT&T right about the time that I passed that. So it was my first engineering position. I started out in sales and moved into engineering. Then went on to achieve the CCNP and eventually the CCIE. And then I've gone back and done a few other certifications since. and it has made a tremendous difference in my career. It allowed me to be able to have a valid level of skills. It created a level of trust among customers when I would deal with them. And obviously I had to deal with the technology. And so I was able to interact in a way that some of my counterparts that were not certified in that area were not able to do. So it was really just a big plus for me. My own journey was largely self-funded simply because the companies I worked for weren't really amenable to providing training. And I can tell you from experience that good training makes all the difference in the world to how you're able to achieve these certifications and actually put them into practice. So I actually want to be able to give you a little bit just in terms of how to get started in the whole idea of this world of Cisco certifications. I'm very much and fond of trains, which is why I picked this particular picture, and plus it sort of fits in with what we're talking about. So the first thing you have to have is you have to have a commitment to learn. If you have difficulty with technology and it's hard to fit the pieces together and you're not committed to it, it's not going to work for you. You can have all the resources, all the opportunities, all the tools that you need, but if you don't have the desire to learn it and then apply it, it's going to be an uphill fight. The second thing you need, and this is really critical, is quality training, hence the reason I picked this slide. Training makes the difference between taking a long time to learn something and being able to learn it and apply it quickly. In my own journey, I basically would just read the books and then hope I knew enough to pass. It's really essential to be able to have a good start. One example that I like to give is I've always been deathly afraid of math, and it probably had to do with the fact that I didn't do particularly well in math classes, and in fact in 5th grade I was in Mrs. Palechia's remedial math. Doesn't exactly inspire confidence. So when I actually came into the world of high tech, I was deathly afraid of binary and all the things that were represented by that. I got through the CCNA and the CCNP simply by memorizing a lot of tables and facts with regard to binary. It wasn't until I started working on my CCIE that I really understood how essential that was to success, which is one of the reasons I typically say understanding binary is the keys to the kingdom when it comes to networking. Everything starts to make sense and fall together when you realize that. Well, why does RIP only have 15 hops? Why does computer memory come in these sort of increments? And it all comes back to understanding how binary operates. Had I realized and grasped that early on, I could have saved myself a load of trouble and difficulty. I did get through it, but I think some of it was just because I slogged through it rather than I had a good grasp of understanding the fundamental pieces of how all these things fit together. And as a trainer, that's one of the things I try to do, is to be able to take what seem like complex and almost magical topics and actually have them make plain sense. One of the things that was beneficial when I worked for AT&T is as an engineer, I understood all the technical concepts, but I frequently was dealing with individuals such as directors and chief information officers that didn't have a background in technology. And so what I was able to do is, because I'd learned it the way that I had, is I was able to explain it in plain English terms to them. And that's what I and TrainSignal try to do with training, is taking these complex topics, presenting them in a way that's familiar, that's easy to grasp, and also easy to apply. And that's one of the things that makes a difference when you actually get good and solid training on the subject. Step 3 is actually going to be getting relevant experience. I was fortunate in my own career to have the opportunity not just to learn, but to apply what I was learning. I've had the opportunity to do installations, for instance, of routing and switching equipment. I have installed the Cisco Unified Compute System. I have worked on Cisco Communications Manager products. And that's one of the things that's key, because getting a certification is great and it's wonderful and it's an achievement that you should be proud of. But if you have the certification and you don't have any experience behind it, it's going to be difficult to convince an employer to give you a job. So experience is important. Now, this is where you sort of get into the chicken and egg discussion, as it's sometimes called. Well, how do I get experience to get this job that I want without having the experience to start with, because no one will give me a chance. And that's what the next step is all about. Well, it's actually step 5. We'll get to that in a moment. But once you've had the relevant experience and you've been able to demonstrate not only do you have the skills and can apply them, it makes all the difference in the world. But one of the things that you need to remember is that you can't rest on your achievements. When I took the CCNA, it was back in 2000. I can tell you from experience, it has changed substantially. It used to just be a matter of knowing the questions and providing the answers, just in a multiple choice format type of exam. Well, as I've had to recertify over the years, I've noticed, of course, one of the well-known facts is the simulation questions, where you have to actually know the command syntax. You have to realize how the protocols interact, or you'll miss the question. And so it's important to stay current on what you know. And it's also a good idea once you've, for instance, when I finished the routing and switching track up through the CCIE, I decided that I wanted to continue to develop. And so I chose voice and then later Cisco UCS as a way of continually adding to my skill set. As you add to your skill set, as you gain more experience, as you demonstrate more and more things that are actually in demand, that'll be something that makes you employable, not just employable, but being able to retain employment, because it's important to stay current and stay relevant. When I took the CCNA, they actually had ISDN, IPX, and they were even talking about token ring. None of those are around today in any real form or fashion. You may find it in a legacy environment, but it's gone. Now, the topics are IP version 6 and virtual private networks and wireless, things that weren't originally a part of it when I took the exam. If I'd stood still, then I wouldn't have been able to stay current. An analogy I like to use is if you've ever gone to a shopping mall or an airport and you see the escalators. Little kids seem to gravitate toward those because they want to walk up the down escalator and so forth. But have you noticed that when someone is walking on an escalator, they have to expend energy just to stand still, let alone being able to get to the top or the bottom respectively. And that's exactly how the world of high tech works. It's constantly evolving, constantly changing. Technologies come, technologies go. Different vendors and providers come and go. But your ability to be able to stay relevant and current with the technology that comes out makes the difference between being in demand and being considered obsolete. So always, always make that a focus. And now I want to actually get to the getting experience part, because again, this question comes back to, all right, I've gotten certified. I have the aptitude and the desire to learn. I want to be able to apply this in an actual work environment. And a good example of this, I want to talk about a guy named Todd. As I mentioned before, I was actually involved, and still am involved, in the Seattle Cisco Users Group, which is in the Pacific Northwest area. And the very first email I ever got from Todd was entitled, and I'm not kidding, it was entitled Desperate Request. And he was actually asking for assistance to be able to achieve his CCNA. Well, we actually host study groups periodically, which some users groups will offer, and he was one of my students. So we went through the principles of ICND1 and ICND2, and he passed the first exam, the CCENT. He was able to get a job at a local school district as a network administrator. And then he was struggling a little bit with the second exam, so I met one-on-one with him. We talked about things that could help him to be able to get through that. He was able to pass that second exam. He now has gone on to a newer and better position. So going from desperate requests to being a successful network professional was, again, being able to get the certification, have the relevant experience, staying current, and then obviously being able to advance his career. So again, getting back to the question about getting experience. How do you get experience? If you can't actually, if you can get the interview and the person that's interviewing you likes you, but there may be 100 other applicants, what is one thing that can help you get closer to the top? Obviously, it's going to be experience. One of the ways to get experience is actually to do volunteer work. Now, it's kind of a good news, bad news. You do volunteer work. Well, that doesn't pay anything. Well, yes, that's true. But you could be working at a regular job that's not in your career field and actually volunteering when you're able to be able to actually get more relevant experience. And I'll give you an example here. I like giving examples because it shows you I'm not just talking theory, but actual real people have done this. My middle son's name is Justin. Justin is extraordinarily brilliant. But Justin didn't have any experience in IT. He actually went to volunteer at the hospital that my wife happens to work at, just volunteering to help out. They noticed that he had a great aptitude for computers, and so they asked him to help out with that. Well, after a couple of months, they realized that he was doing such a great job that they offered him a part-time position. Not long after that, because everybody loved him and he was so good and so skilled, and mind you, he didn't have any certifications whatsoever. They offered him a full-time job, and he was there for several years. Now he works at a contractor for Microsoft, making exceptionally good money because he was able to get experience that started with a volunteer situation. Now, it could be that it could be a nonprofit group, could be like the hospital. There are all sorts of opportunities where nonprofits would be glad to have your assistance. And one of the reasons why that's good is they're getting something out of it because you're offering them your expertise and assistance. And they are going to very likely be very, very happy to offer a reference for how well you did with their particular network technology as you move on to other things. So that's one really relevant way to be able to get experience. The other is internships. Now, internships can work one of a couple of ways. There are some internships where they essentially, it's like a volunteer position, although it's an official position, where you actually are able to work at a company, gain experience. It sometimes could be like an apprenticeship, where you're gaining experience by working with someone else. I actually worked at a company a couple of years ago, a Cisco partner, Cisco Gold partner to be specific, that actually would hire entry-level people to be able to work alongside experienced engineers. And it might have just been a matter of putting equipment in a rack, because very certified, experienced individuals usually cost more than people that are just getting into the market. So some companies will say, well, we could actually employ some people here in this position and give them some relevant experience. Then there are internships that are paid internships. Sometimes you can look at those through local colleges, universities. Maybe there's something through some companies. I know some large companies will actually employ interns in the technical positions in order to be able to look and groom people for future work. And then this is what I was sort of alluding to, is entry-level positions with advancement. These are positions like the ones I just described, where it might just be a matter of assisting by bolting the equipment in the rack or physically connecting them up, but not necessarily configuring them. But if that position is viewed as a springboard to something better, then it can really make a big difference. And if you think about it, it's kind of a way of interviewing that companies use that has a lot of perks to it. Because if someone comes in, they've got a great work ethic, they have a wonderful attitude, they do whatever they have to do to get the job done, and they're willing to learn, that's worth a lot to a company. And those kind of individuals would be the first to be chosen for more senior positions or junior positions within the organization that continue to have advancement. So these entry-level positions can actually be very helpful. It may not be that glamorous, the pay may not be exactly what you want, but it really helps you get your foot in the door in an organization. An example that I would give you in my own personal experience is I started out at AT&T as a sales rep, and I wanted to be in the engineering ranks. I was able to demonstrate to them while I was trying to do my sales job that I was exceptionally good, experienced, and knowledgeable in matters relating to Cisco. And that ended up being the very reason I was offered an engineering position later, and I've done that for a number of years, as I mentioned. So sometimes just being able to get your foot in the door is enough to be able to get you started when it comes to that sort of experience. And another thing that you might consider is contract work. The way contract work operates, and there's a number of Cisco certified individuals that go down this route, is you're not working for a specific company and getting a salary from them. Instead, you're actually working on a specific project that usually has a beginning and an ending. And so that's one of the things that you can do is you could get a contract that may be somewhat basic with a particular company. And again, it could be something that leads to more contracts. In fact, a lot of Cisco certified individuals who just line up a set of contracts where essentially you're being paid by a job rather than by the hour, by salary, whatever the case might be. Businesses like it because it's less expensive for them, and contractors like it because it gives them a lot of freedom. Now, one of the things to keep in mind with contract work is typically you don't have health care or other benefits. My wife happens to work for a large hospital, so my benefits are actually coming through her work. So for me, it doesn't really matter whether or not I'm getting, the extra benefits for that. And I do a lot of contract work myself because I like the freedom of it. I've gotten to a point where I can be working at a Starbucks, I can be working in a public library, I can be working on a plane, and ultimately it just comes down to I'm being paid by the job. So these are some ways that you can legitimately get experience in the whole matter of Cisco networking and to be able to earn the kind of expertise that you need to be able to get to the next level. Now that actually ends the formal part of my presentation. And so now I want to open it up and see if I might be able to answer any questions that you might have.
All right, Joe. We have a question right here that says his problem is in job hunting without having a certification, it's much harder to get a foot in the door, even with lots of experience, like 20 plus years of experience. Do you have any advice for what someone in that kind of position can do?
Yes, because I've come across things like that myself. It's sometimes staggering to me how companies will not take into account the kind of experience that an individual has. For instance, I've got a number of friends that work, in fact, they happen to work for AT&T, and they've got numerous years experience in telecommunications and equipment, networking, and so forth, and they're not even given a second chance because they don't have the minimum level of certification that's going on. One of the things that can be helpful is if you're working on the certification, even if you don't have it yet, you can actually put that as part of your education and say expected date such and such. I know when I've been working on various certifications and degrees, I've been able to put them in my resume saying I'm working on X. It does a couple things. It demonstrates to an employer you want to learn, you're self-motivated, you're on the track to getting that, and that may actually give you a little bit of help in getting into the door. It's certainly not a substitute for actually achieving the full certification, but it actually demonstrates to an employer that you're committed and want to be able to actually achieve that.
Okay, Joe. What about someone's asking, what about people that have an interest in cybersecurity or Cisco design?
Well, that's a good question. These would fall into two different tracks. Obviously, you have the CCNA, NP, and IE security. And on security, you actually have a lot more options than probably just about anything else, because with security, there are a number of certifications, and I think the Cisco certifications are golden all by themselves, but you have other, what I'd call industry standard certifications, for instance, the CISSP, which is recognized more broadly as just vendor neutral. Obviously, there are some specializations you could get into within that. I mean, aside from the Cisco certifications to CISSP, you can actually narrow down into some specific parts of that. For instance, in healthcare, you have HIPAA. If you are able to say, well, I have experience in HIPAA or have a HIPAA-related certification, that stands for Healthcare Industry Portability and Accountability Act. It was actually passed a number of years ago. But it was actually designed to make healthcare portable, and it's actually turned into sort of a standard for security. But that's one area within cybersecurity that is really, really, really in demand, because as technology is introduced more and more and more with electronic medical records and being able to digitize all the images, my wife works in medical imaging, I'm well aware of this, that really can put you in demand. Another along those lines is PCI, which stands for Payment Card Industry. It's not a certification that's government sponsored per se. It's actually sort of a self-policing mechanism that all the different payment card vendors have put into effect. I remember for a local bank, I actually did a very scaled down version of it about some potential areas of security. And it's really amazing when you understand the principles of what's involved in those kinds of standards that you can really, really make quite a name for yourself and a great niche. Because again, one of the things that a finance company does not want is a data breach. It impacts how people look at them. It impacts maybe a stock price. So on the cybersecurity front, that can be great. In addition to being able to get like Cisco certifications and maybe something like the CISSP, being able to delve down in a specific aspect of cybersecurity can really make a great niche for you to fit into. Now, in terms of design, design's great because it covers so many different things. Now, obviously, you've got sub-technologies like security and voice and whatnot, but being able to, for example, get the CCDA. When I took my CCDA exam, I was kind of amazed because the CCNA is all about technology and how it fits together and all these different piece parts, but at the same time, it was very process focused. How many broadcasts are on your network? How many connections do you have? I mean, and things that were much more esoteric and not quite artistic, but certainly not deeply technical the way the CCNA was. And so design is good because when you have a certification that demonstrates I know how to actually build a network, and you can actually reference networks that you've built, that really sets you apart from a design perspective. Even if you don't go as far as the CCDE and Cisco Certified Architect, there's a lot to go on with design, particularly if you're in a pre-sales environment like I was. The CCIE was very, very critical and helpful, but knowing that I had design certifications that demonstrated I knew how to build a network well, that really helped out a lot.
Okay. Here we have Greg who's asking, "Hi Joe, I'm an experienced CCNA certified pro, and I seek to earn the CCMP and CCIE RNS. What would you recommend as a path to those certifications, i.e. readings, boot camps, etc.?"
And there are a lot of great opportunities for learning at the professional and expert levels. I know, for example, TrainSignal actually just put out a CCNP package last year, and surprise, surprise, I happen to have a hand in that. And one of the things that's good no matter what training you're looking at is always make sure that the training maps to the exam blueprint. If you go on www.cisco.com/certifications, every certification, whether it's CCNA, CCNA Security, CCIE, wireless, whatever it is, you're going to find an exam blueprint. And that exam blueprint is certainly not exhaustive, but it gives you the lion's share of the topics you can expect to see on any one of those exams. Always make sure the training that you're taking is mapped to those exam blueprints. I've seen over the years, I've seen various training groups talk about all the wonderful training that they have, and yet what's listed for the descriptions of their courses is either covering old technology or it's not covering current versions. As you know, Cisco releases updates periodically to the different certifications. So always make sure that what you're doing, whether CCNP, IE, whatever, is mapping to those exam blueprints. Second of all, look and see how it actually talks about applying it to the real world, because certifications are wonderful. I've obviously enjoyed my share of achieving them, but it's also important not to be what they call a paper CCNP or paper CCIE, where you have the certification, but you're not demonstrating the ability to be able to apply it. Just to share you my own embarrassing story, I took the CCIE 5 times before passing it. Keep in mind that the average rate's about 2.5 to 3. And I was kind of embarrassed about that for a long time, but one of the earliest CCIEs was an individual by the name of Carl Soley, who's actually written a number of the CCIE practical studies books, and he actually personally said to me, he said, being able to take it that many times, you've seen so many different ways that the exam is laid out that you're actually ahead of people in the real world that have only taken it once or twice and passed. So make sure you have a good training package, one that maps the exam blueprint. Make sure you have an opportunity to be able to apply it hands-on. This is absolutely critical, not just for the CCI, but for the CCNP as well. So usually having some kind of a lab that's big enough and comprehensive enough to be able to actually give you the opportunity to try out all the different things. I mean, even up till now, even if the equipment's a little older, you have your 2600 and 2600XM series. They're older routers. They can't do everything that you would need, but they can do a great deal of what you would need. I think the only spot that's a little weaker is on IP version 6. So you can assemble a lab that isn't violently expensive. You can get things fairly well. You can rent rack time, but the idea is to be able to have a good course, have good workbooks that give you labs that are challenging to help you integrate all of these things. I know that's one of the things that when I got to the CIE level myself, it's like, wow, I didn't realize how much this stuff all has to fit together. I forgot about, just for example, like ARP, that's an important role that you might not think of later when you're configuring an access list, but knowing how all those things interact is important. So at the CCNP level and the IE level and anything else, make sure you have a good course that's mapped to the exam blueprint. Make sure you have good lab guides that you can be challenged in to really help you understand the technology and how it applies. And then practice, 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 practice.
Okay, now Jamie has a question. He wants your recommendations on setting up a lab to work on.
Okay, and that's a great question. I've kind of been a lab nut myself. And one of the things that I did early on is I would do whatever I had to do to get my hands on equipment. You have a couple options when it comes to building a lab. You can do, and I'm particularly biased in this regard, when you're working at the CCNA level and even to some degree at the CCNP level, you can use some simulators and get a certain portion of the experience. There's GNS3, for example. I'm not as big a fan of GNS3 because most of the times when I've used it, it's crashed. So my preference is a physical lab. If you can't, I mean, if you don't want to go the rental rack route, eBay is replete with tons of equipment that you can get fairly inexpensively. Usually for a CCNA level, for example, I recommend probably 3, maybe 4 routers. You can probably get away with 3 routers, and you can actually do one switch connected to all 3 routers and sort of represent your multiple VLANs on that the way you're setting it up. You can also, when you get to the CCNP level, having a couple switches all connected together is helpful because you have things like VTP and VLANs and trunks and things like that that you want to actually get experiences on. And the switches that actually will give that to you, layer 2 switches, are really inexpensive. 2950s, for example, I have them in my lab because they're next to nothing. The code's still fairly current, and I could do all those advanced switching things with that. When I was doing my CCNA study groups a number of years ago, I had a little too ancient equipment, and it wouldn't do some of the newer spanning tree protocols. And so I've learned that you need to have something that's current enough to be able to get everything. So CCNA level, 3 routers, 4 routers and a switch is going to be more than enough. You can configure one as a frame relay switch, for example. And then there are obviously some things that you can do as you get into the CCNP level, expand a little bit. Always make sure you can go through and actually map out things in the different exam topics. Like in CCNP, you've got multiple routing protocols. You might want to configure redistribution, and you can't really do that with 2 routers. You need more like 4 or so. So anything you can get your hands on is good. Sometimes equipment will be getting, old equipment, the place you work may be getting rid of it. Or you also might contact your local Cisco office because sometimes they have e-waste, and that's basically the new, basically trying to keep, PCBs and, critical stuff that will poison the environment in landfills. And so they'll actually make the equipment available to people as long as it's never put in a production network kind of thing. So a local Cisco office or users group might be an option.
Okay, great question. So Anas is asking, I'm really interested in cloud computing and virtualization, but I took some courses at college that dealt with Cisco routing tables, switching, etc. Are there any specific Cisco certificates or courses that could help people going for cloud computing careers?
And actually, that's an excellent question. Let me interject one thing really quick that's important, though. Let me tell you just another quick story. I don't want to belabor the point, but I worked with an individual a number of years ago that wanted to be a CCIE voice and was actually very experienced with the whole voice over IP realm. And I remember him making the comment that he didn't need to study that routing and switching crap, and those were his exact words. And yet, when we were doing an installation later, there were some things that he configured on the equipment that would have required the customer to actually buy a $3,000 software upgrade on one of the switches to support a feature that they wanted, whereas there was another way to configure it where they could have just used their existing equipment. So I understand that your interest is in cloud computing, and you certainly want to spend the lion's share of your time studying that, but don't devalue the underlying technology, knowing how IP networking works, knowing how routing tables work, how switching tables work. Those are going to be underlying things that you'll need to take into account. Now, more specifically to your question, Cisco has a number of courses, certificates, and so forth available that target this. Obviously, you have the data center track would obviously be the most interest to you, but there are also some specific things with regard to storage networking, because there are storage networking certifications. There are also the Cisco Unified Compute System, which is cloud computing at its best, because it takes, you not only have the underlying infrastructure, but you have virtualization, whether it's ESX, ESXi, or Microsoft Hyper-V, or whatever particular track you're taking, and how storage interacts with that, and how it fits into the data center. So the DCUCD exam, that's Data Center Unified Computing Design. There's also the Data Center Unified Infrastructure, which is more on deployment, but both of those kinds of courses are helpful, as well as understanding VMware. Knowing how VMware operates and hypervisors and all those resources is also going to be really important in the cloud computing environment. In this case, it's not a either or with Cisco, it's a both and. I think Cisco and VMware together make this wonderful 1-2 punch to be able to really help you get a lot of the technology down, and even something storage related would be helpful. I have a rudimentary knowledge of how storage networking operates. Obviously, for me, if it was broader, I'd have a much greater appreciation. But in a cloud computing environment, storage, virtualization, and infrastructure are all going to be equally important, but especially with your virtualization, Cisco UCS types of things.
Okay. Michael's asking just for some straight up test taking tips for the CCNA exam.
One of my favorite topics. There are a couple things to know right out. Yeah, there's what I call the mundane and less practical things. Get there early. I actually had an experience one time where the testing center had been closed, and because of weather, and that was kind of interesting. If I'd called ahead, I could have saved myself a trip. But getting there early is always helpful. It usually tends to get rid of your jitters and nervousness. When you actually take the test, there's a couple things to keep in mind. You can't go back. What I mean by that is a long, long, long time ago, when certification tests first came out, you had the opportunity of, you might come to a question, let's say question 1 you weren't sure about, and you could skip ahead to you get to question 14, and the way the question's worded can help you go back and answer question 1 better. Well, they don't let you do that anymore. So realize that once you've answered a question, you're done. If you click next without answering the question, usually you'll get some sort of a warning, but you have to answer the question that you're in. You can't skip around and move back and forth. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The second is to let the test work for you. Sometimes on practice tests, they'll ask you this very open-ended question. You're just supposed to give however many answers you think there are. Check all that apply is the way that you see that. Well, Cisco exams are not like that. If there are 3 answers, it'll say pick 3 answers. If it says there's 1 answer, you can only pick 1 answer. And if you try to pick 4 answers when you have 3 answers, you get the, I'm sorry, you picked too many answers. So that's one thing you don't have to stress about. You'll know exactly how many questions or answers that you need for a particular question. So let that work for you. Another thing is, when you're taking the exam, if you're not sure about something, try to go back to the fundamentals. If it's asking, for instance, about a routing protocol, try to think about the underlying processes. And there have been times when I got stuck on an exam, and that's what I've done. It's like, I have no clue what this is. And I try to think about whatever other protocols were involved in that. And in some cases, not all of them, but in a number of them, I was able to sort of rule stuff out that way. Another thing to do, and I've done constantly, is you'll almost always have some kind of multiple choice questions. And what I've always tried to do is I'll write down, they give you like a little dry erase pad, and I'll actually write down all the numbers of the answers, A, B, C, D, E. And then I try to go through and kind of like in Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, phone a friend, or 50-50, where you try to eliminate answers. And that's what you do. You go, okay, it can't be this one, because usually there's one question that has the most ridiculous answer that only, someone that had no clue about networking would pick. Then there are some others that are a little trickier, and usually it comes down to two very similar answers. And this is why always read the question through a couple of times. I mean, you've got to be conscious of time when you're taking these in, but read it through a couple of times. Make sure you know exactly what it is they're asking. And then when you get down to those two answers that are a lot alike, number one, always pick the one that's the closest to answering the Cisco version of the answer. So if in Cisco literature and documentation and training, it says the Cisco official answer is X, even if it's A, not technically true, or B, doesn't seem accurate, the Cisco answer is always the right answer. And I'll give you an example. The way queuing is spelled, Q-U-E-U-I-N-G, that's the correct spelling. And yet in iOS, it's Q-U-E-U-E-I-N-G. It's easy to look at that and go, oh, that can't be right because it's misspelled. Yes, it is, but that's the way iOS spells it, so therefore, that's your right answer. So use a process of elimination, and remember the Cisco's answer is always the right answer. And I guess the biggest thing is don't freak out. I mean, take it from someone who failed the CCI exam 4 times. If for some reason you miss it by a couple of points, think of it as a dress rehearsal. Usually the first time I've ever sat for an exam has been really, really tough. And then once I've gone the second time, I've known kind of what the questions were like, what the experience was like, how I could pace my time better. So never think of it as, you've gone down in flames. You get credit, you get street credit just for being able to sit down and take the exam, because there's lots of people that don't even get to that level. So process of elimination, let the test work for you. Try to remember the Cisco answer is always the right answer, and then again, go back to basics. Those have always helped me.
Okay. Ken is asking about what you think about the new CCT online learning through Cisco, and if you think it's a good place to start for something like the CCENT.
It certainly can be. I know one of the things that I've noticed is that Cisco has really amped up their game when it comes to on-demand learning. I mean, in fact, just to be really honest, the entire industry used to run on, you sign up for a $3,000 class, you sit for a week or so, and it's a great concept, but it's really expensive. And with IT budgets getting tightened, the classroom-based learning is tougher and tougher to justify unless it's in the town you have to live in, because you think the class is $3,000, then there's the airplane ticket, then there's a week of food, and then you're off work for a week, and all these things. And so a lot of companies don't warm up to that. So these on-demand learning type environments are really good. And that's, again, Cisco's really amped up their game. So yeah, I think there's merit to it. I think the best experience, and this may be just sort of in the ideal world, the best experience you can get is when you're getting quality learning that's covering, like I said before, the exam blueprint and also how things work in the real world. You have the opportunity to practically apply that somehow, and then being able to demonstrate that obviously in an exam. So I do think the things on the Cisco website are great. I think there's a lot available. If you work for a Cisco partner, I might add that there are labs available through the Partner Education Connection, they sometimes call it the PEC, that maybe they're not specifically certification related, but they give you the opportunity to work on real equipment that they have staged in their cloud. So that can be another good way to get around not having live equipment. If you're working for a Cisco partner, for example, you'll have access to that. Yeah, I think the stuff that Cisco's putting out is really good. I, of course, wouldn't discount the kind of training that we're doing at Train Signal. A lot of it comes out of practical experience, so keep that in mind as well.
Okay, the next question is, what kind of feedback does Cisco give from the exam, especially if you didn't pass?
Great question. Again, having sat through many an exam myself, it can sometimes be a little esoteric because, for instance, you may have a 90-minute exam and there were 70 questions. And you're not always sure or cannot always remember, at least I couldn't, okay, how many of those were security questions? How many of those were routing questions? How many of those were IP services questions, so forth, just using the CCNA as an example. You'll get a score report when you're done. Well, the first thing is when you're done with the exam, you'll get a splash screen the second you're finished where it'll either say, congratulations or sorry, which isn't much of a comfort. And it'll tell you what your score was, so much out of so many points. It's usually like 800 out of 1,000 or something like that, depending on the exam. When you go get your score report, it'll actually be broken down per subject area question. So if you only got 10% of the security questions right, it'll say that. You may not remember how many questions were along that particular subject, but it gives you a really good idea of where you were strong and where you needed improvement. For me, honestly, in the grand scheme of things, I would always trip out a little bit more on security than on any other area. And this was even true when I was taking my CCIE exam, which the lab exam is impossible to really be able to accurately decode just because there's so many variables. But your score report's going to be your best friend there. And then usually as a result of that, you say, okay, so maybe IP services was weaker for me, DHCP, DNS, ARP. And you just concentrate more on those without getting weak on the area that you already did well in. You always have to make sure you keep your understanding up on that. But that's usually the easiest way to do it, is to take your score report and sort of use it as a blueprint for whatever you may need to study next if indeed you didn't pass. And even if you did, if you got like hundreds on almost everything and you kind of bombed out in one area, just for your own professional career, go back and build up on that. Even though you passed the exam, make sure you have a good solid understanding of it, because it's those little details that can really make the difference between success and failure in real world networks.
Okay. Kevin is asking, would you recommend getting the CCENT before the CCNA or going straight for the CCNA?
And the answer to that is it depends, which makes us all consultants, right? And the reason why I say it that way is because a lot of it has to do with what your understanding of networking is previously. If you've got a fairly good grasp of some of the basics, you can probably jump into the CCNA exam itself. But the reason why I say that is because it's such a broader set of questions, because you're hitting every area sort of all at once. Whereas if you do the ICND1 for the CCENT and the ICND2 separately, you can focus more on just those topics. So if it's something you're not as strong in and you're sort of a newcomer, I was fortunate I passed my CCNA exam, but it would have probably been easier to do the two exams since I just came completely out of a different industry. So basically assess your strength and figure it out. And worst case, if you want to go and take and I know money's not infinite, so I'm aware of that, you could always take the CCNA exam, and if you feel like it was too much, then you can go back and take the two individual ones. Or if you want to hedge your bet, you might have an easier time just with the two exam track. But start with what you feel your strength level is, and then you can probably make a better choice as to which one to go with.
Okay. Now we have time for one last question about hardware. Anas is asking again, is using Packet Tracer Labs enough to get started, or getting actual equipment, even though it's a bit expensive? What's your opinion on that?
Well, I think ultimately the reason why equipment is better is because you get an more accurate picture of how it actually operates. And I've used Packet Tracer. I sometimes will try to, especially with my CCNA and even to some degree CCNP levels, to try to map some things out. But it's interesting, sometimes the things that Packet Tracer doesn't cover. I think in the beginning stages it is a great place to start, because you can usually get it fairly simply, and there's no real cost involved, especially if you're part of a Cisco networking academy, and it can really help you cover a lot of basics. But there are going to be things about Packet Tracer where certain features are going to get left out. So that's probably a good place to start if you really have difficulty getting a hold of real equipment. Start there. But when you have an opportunity, go to real equipment, just because it gives you a much more accurate view of how it works in the real world, and then also what you can encounter on the exam.
Okay, that's all the time we have today. Thanks again, everyone, for attending and for your participation. As a reminder, today's webinar was recorded and will be available to view at trainsignal.com/blog/webinars. We will also email you a link by the end of this week. Remember, as you leave, please fill out the survey and you'll have a chance to win a copy of Cisco CCNA training by Joe. We will email the winner by the end of the week. Thanks again, and everyone have a great day.